At 1417 on July 7, 1944, near St. Lo, Normandy, Untersturmführer Karl-Heinz Bremer stood half out of the open commander's hatch of Tiger, I number 312, 2. Company, Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 101. He was 26 years old. He had commanded tanks for 31 months. He had destroyed 14 enemy vehicles, 9 of them medium tanks, since Kursk. His headset crackled with clipped voices. The air smelled of crushed hedgerow leaves, cordite residue from the morning's skirmish, and hot oil venting from the Maybach engine below his boots. Bremer had been taught that the Tiger was finality. 88 millimeters of gun steel, 100 millimeters of frontal armor, a machine that ended arguments at 2,000 meters. In training, they had shown diagrams where American shells flattened or split, where enemy crews burned, without ever seeing the Tiger that killed them. He believed this because it had been true. In Russia, a single Tiger had held a village for half a day. In Italy, Shermans had backed away once the first one died. Doctrine said American tanks were fast, unreliable, and thin-skinned. Doctrine said they came in groups because they had to. At 1419, the first Sherman appeared at the far edge of the orchard, moving left to right, hull rocking as it crossed a drainage ditch. It did not stop. It did not attempt to flank wide. It drove directly into Bremer's field of fire. Bremer ordered the gunner to traverse 10 degrees. The turret motor whined. The crosshair settled. The range was 800 meters. This was inside comfort. This was where the Tiger ended things cleanly. The 88 fired at 1420. The shell hit the Sherman square in the glacis and punched through. The American tank halted. Smoke vented from the hatches. No return fire. Bremer watched the crew bail out. It was textbook. 1 shot. 1 kill. The radio carried calm confirmation from the platoon leader. Ammunition count adjusted by 1. At 1421, a second Sherman crested the same ditch. Then a third. Then a fourth, spaced 30 meters apart, moving at identical speed. They did not slow when the first tank burned. They did not maneuver. They drove forward as if the orchard were empty. Bremer felt the first contraction in his stomach. It was not fear. It was irritation. American waste. American sloppiness. He ordered fire again. At 1422, the second Sherman died. At 1423, the third reversed abruptly, smoke popping from its exhaust as it backed behind an apple tree line. The fourth stopped, turret turning, gun elevating. It fired. The round hit Tiger 312 on the right side of the turret, high, glancing off with a metallic crack that vibrated through Bremer's boots. Paint flakes drifted inside the turret. The hit did not penetrate. The armor held. Bremer laughed once, short and involuntary, and ordered return fire. The fourth Sherman reversed out of sight before the 88 could fire. This was the first contradiction. The Sherman had fired first. It had not waited. It had not flinched. At 1424, another Sherman appeared from a different hedgerow gap, 70 meters to the left of the first approach. Then another behind it. Then another. They came from angles Bremer had not plotted. They were not massed. They were distributed. They fired as they moved. Shells struck the Tiger's hull and turret in rapid sequence. One hit the mantlet. One struck the lower hull front. Another impacted the left side of the turret ring. None penetrated. All of them hit. 5 hits in under 90 seconds. The Tiger was still alive. But the noise inside the turret changed. The impacts rang differently. The optics shuddered. The gunner cursed as his sight jumped off target. The loader's hands shook as he rammed another round home. Bremer realized the Americans were not trying to penetrate from the front. They were not trying to win the duel the way doctrine said a duel should be fought. They were keeping the Tiger busy. At 1426, a Sherman appeared behind Tiger 312, coming through a lane Bremer had assumed impassable because of mud. Its engine revved high. It closed to 400 meters. Bremer shouted for traverse. The turret began to swing. It was too slow. The Sherman fired. The round hit the rear deck, not penetrating, but denting the grille and sending fragments into the engine compartment. Smoke began to seep into the fighting compartment. Not fire. Smoke. The smell of hot oil intensified. Bremer ordered the driver forward. The Tiger lurched. Another Sherman fired from the right. Another from the front. Hits continued. Still no penetration. But the Tiger was no longer dictating the fight. They had planned for one. By 1427, there were 9. Bremer later told an interrogator that the number itself changed the air inside the turret. Not panic. Compression. The sense that space was being reduced by metal and engines closing from every direction. He had been trained to think in arcs and ranges. Now there were only seconds. Unteroffizier Franz Lenz, Loader, later wrote in his diary, 1946, "We were struck again and again, not to kill us, but to make us turn, to make us look." I remember thinking they were not afraid of us at all. At 14:28, Bremer finally caught one Sherman broadside at 200 meters. The 88 fired. The American tank exploded, turret lifting slightly before settling back. Bremer did not feel relief. He felt delay. Another Sherman immediately took its place. The Americans did not stop firing when they missed. They did not stop when they bounced. They fired again, and again, and again. This was not marksmanship. This was volume. Bremer had been taught that American crews were poorly trained. But what he saw were crews that did not pause to admire results. They fired on the move. They adjusted quickly. They communicated with hand signals when radios failed. They exposed themselves briefly, then disappeared behind hedges that had not existed on his map. At 14:30, Tiger 312 took its sixth hit. Then its seventh. The turret ring jammed briefly. The gunner slapped the mechanism. The turret moved again, slower now. Another human detail intruded. The loader vomited into the corner of the turret without stopping his work. The driver's hands were white on the controls. No one spoke except Bremer. At 14:32, Bremer heard a sound he did not recognize at first. It was not a shell impact. It was a sharp, tearing crack followed by a rush of air. The engine coughed. The temperature gauge spiked. The Sherman behind them had fired again. This time the round penetrated the weakened rear deck. The Tiger did not explode. It did not burn. It lost power. The Tiger stopped. Bremer ordered evacuation. The hatch was opened. Outside, the orchard was full of movement. Shermans repositioned calmly, some passing the burning wrecks of their own tanks without slowing. Infantry followed them, rifles at the ready, stepping around shell craters with practiced ease. Bremer jumped down and ran. He did not look back. In a POW interrogation, August 1944, Bremer said, "I believed our tank was invincible if handled correctly." That belief did not survive contact with their numbers. The contradiction widened as the afternoon continued. Tigers elsewhere in the sector reported similar engagements. Single American tanks died quickly. Groups did not. The Americans did not seek Tigers. They found them by moving everywhere at once. Oberfeldwebel Otto Kramer of Panzerlehr later wrote in his memoir, 1953, "We expected them to learn caution. Instead, they learned replacement." At 1610, a recovery crew counted 5 Sherman wrecks near Tiger 312. By 1800 hours, there were 12 more moving through the same orchard. The count did not matter. The rate did. They had expected the Americans to break after losing 6. By nightfall, 64 had passed through that grid square. A German staff officer wrote in a situation report that evening that enemy armor losses were acceptable to them. The phrase was underlined twice. Bremer sat in a temporary holding area that night, hands still trembling, watching American soldiers eat from tins, laughing, trading cigarettes. One dropped a chocolate bar into the mud and did not retrieve it. The Tiger had taken 5 direct hits and survived. That fact no longer meant victory. At 1441 on July 7, 1944, the same hedgerows west of St. Lo were still vibrating from engine noise when Oberstleutnant Ernst Voigt, operations officer for Panzerlehr Division, checked his wristwatch and realized the Americans had not paused to reorganize. He was 41 years old. He had served since 1939. He had memorized fuel tables and ammunition burn rates. What he saw unfolding did not fit any of them. The Sherman columns kept arriving without visible preparation. No artillery pause. No smoke screen signaling a deliberate push. Just movement. Continuous. Tanks rolling past knocked-out hulls while recovery vehicles already hooked cables to the wrecks. Infantry rode the decks briefly, then dismounted, then mounted again farther forward. The Americans were not resetting. They were cycling. Voigt expected that after the loss of several tanks the advance would slow while replacements were brought up. Instead, the replacements were already present. At 1444, a radio intercept confirmed that an American armored battalion had committed a second company before the first had fully engaged. This was not doctrinal caution. This was throughput. They had planned for 36 enemy tanks in the sector. By 1530, 92 had been identified moving through the same 5 kilometers. The Tiger units began to reposition, attempting to regain long-range engagement distances. The terrain refused to cooperate. Hedgerows compressed lines of sight to under 400 meters. Every move required exposing a flank to something unseen. American tanks appeared where maps said there were no lanes. Bulldozers followed close behind, carving gaps while the fighting continued. At 1512, Voigt watched a Sherman push directly through a hedge thick enough to stop a truck. The hedge collapsed. The tank did not slow. Another followed. Then another. German doctrine had assumed obstacles as constants. The Americans treated them as delays. A Tiger from 1 company attempted to anchor a crossroads at 1520. It destroyed 3 Shermans in 5 minutes. Then a 4th fired smoke directly into the Tiger's vision ports. A 5th hit the tracks. A 6th circled wide and fired into the rear quarter. The Tiger burned. The crossroads remained American. Hauptmann Rolf Meissner later wrote in his diary, 1947, "They did not beat us with better tanks. They beat us with uninterrupted presence." Fuel scarcity began asserting itself without announcement. At 1600 hours, a Panther platoon reported 2 vehicles immobilized not by enemy fire, but by empty tanks. Their fuel allocation had been calculated for 1 major engagement. This was the 3rd of the day. The Americans did not pause when darkness approached. Headlights flicked on briefly, then off. Engines idled without concern for concealment. They trusted movement over silence. Another contradiction surfaced in the repair zones. A Sherman with a cracked transmission housing arrived at a forward maintenance point at 1630. By 1658, it was moving again. German recovery teams were still waiting for spare parts promised that morning. They had expected American logistics to be clumsy. Instead, it was local. At 1710, a captured American tank commander was interrogated briefly before being sent rearward. He was 22. He did not know how many tanks his unit had lost that day. He knew how many were still operational. He answered immediately. The number was higher than Voigt's entire remaining armored strength. Statistical certainty began replacing tactical thinking. Every German tank kill now required accounting not just for the immediate exchange, but for what followed. For every Sherman destroyed, another appeared within minutes. Sometimes 2. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Saul, gunner, Schwer Panzerabteilung 503, later wrote in a POW statement, 1944, "We fired until the barrel was hot, and then we fired more." They did not seem to notice. Human moments punctuated the scale. A German loader carefully wiped oil from a shell casing before ramming it home, hands steady despite exhaustion. Across the field, an American crew brewed coffee beside their tank while waiting for orders, steam rising openly. No one fired at them. Targets were everywhere else. At 1745, Voigt received confirmation that American units were rotating crews without withdrawing vehicles. Fresh men climbed into tanks that had been fighting since morning. German crews remained until their machines stopped, or they did. The doctrine began collapsing quietly. Tigers were no longer deployed as spearheads, but as mobile roadblocks, attempting to slow flows rather than stop them. Panthers avoided engagement entirely unless certain of a kill. The battlefield became less about winning and more about delaying. They had planned for ammunition expenditure of 40% by nightfall. By 1830, some units reported 70% gone. The Americans were still firing. Lieutenant Hans Becker later wrote in his notebook, 1945, "We counted shells. They counted minutes." At 1852, another Tiger reported being hit repeatedly without penetration. It withdrew successfully. The crew cheered briefly. 10 minutes later, it was hit again, this time by a tank it had not seen. The turret jammed permanently. The crew abandoned it intact. American tanks did not linger over trophies. They bypassed abandoned vehicles and pressed forward. Infantry marked them for later recovery. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was urgent. By 1930, the realization hardened. This was not a battle to be won through skill accumulation. Skill was being diluted by repetition. Experience mattered less when the enemy could afford to lose it. A final report crossed Voigt's desk just before dusk. American armored losses were estimated at 27 destroyed. American armored strength in the sector had increased. He wrote one line in the margin and underlined it once. At 6:18 on July 8, 1944, in a temporary holding area east of St. Lo, Oberstfreiter Ludwig Mertens sat on an ammunition crate and tried to light a cigarette with hands that would not stop shaking. He was 20 years old. He had arrived in Normandy 12 days earlier. His unit no longer existed in operational terms. Around him, burned-out Panthers steamed faintly in the morning cool, metal ticking as it contracted. American engines were already audible again, steady and numerous, like a factory floor waking up. The night had not ended the fighting. It had only thinned the pauses between it. German formations were now fragments moving between larger American movements. Orders arrived late or not at all. Fuel trucks failed to appear. Radios worked intermittently. The Americans advanced anyway. They did not wait for clarity. They generated it by moving forward. At 7:02, an American armored column crossed a road junction that German maps still marked as contested. No resistance met them. The defenders had withdrawn after midnight, not because of losses, but because they could no longer calculate what was coming next. A statistical truth had replaced ideology. It did not argue. It did not persuade. It accumulated. They had believed the Tiger's armor represented certainty. By the morning of the 8th, certainty had shifted. The Americans no longer needed to kill Tigers quickly. They only needed to encounter them repeatedly. A Tiger delayed cost fuel. Fuel cost movement. Movement cost survival. In a POW interrogation conducted on July 9th, Unteroffizier Franz Lenz said, "We were still alive, but we were finished." There is a difference. The battlefield filled with evidence of quiet surrender. Abandoned guns with breeches intact. Vehicles parked carefully under trees, hatches open, crews gone. Not routed. Released. Human details persisted. A German mechanic carefully stacked and used tools beside a disabled Panther before walking away. An American soldier paused to read a German ration label aloud, mispronouncing the words, then tossed it aside and opened a fresh can from his pack. At 9:15, American engineers began widening hedgerow gaps even where no resistance remained. The work continued without urgency. It was assumed they would be needed again. German doctrine still existed on paper. In practice, it had been outpaced. Orders called for counterattacks that could not assemble. Timetables referenced units that no longer moved. The Americans did not appear to notice the collapse. They treated it as terrain. Oberstleutnant Voigt surrendered that afternoon. In a post-war interview, 1951, he said, "We thought war was decided by moments. They decided it by supply." By evening, American tanks parked nose to tail along roads that had been contested 48 hours earlier. Crews rotated out. New crews rotated in. Engines cooled. Ammunition was restocked. Fuel lines ran uninterrupted. German prisoners watched this with a detached attention. No speeches were made. No victory gestures. Just continuity. Gefreiter Mertens later wrote in a letter never sent, 1944, they had more than machines. They had time. The ideological structure that had promised decisive weapons and elite mastery did not collapse in a single defeat. It thinned. It stretched. It failed to regenerate. Every engagement removed pieces faster than they could be replaced. Post-war admissions reflected this without ornament. Heinz Guderian wrote in 1952, "Our tanks were superior individually. Their system was superior always. The Sherman that had taken 5 direct hits and kept moving was not an exception. It was a symptom. It absorbed punishment because it did not need to be perfect. It needed to be present. Again, and again, and again." By the time the war ended, the lesson was no longer debated. It was counted. Production numbers. Replacement rates. Distances crossed while the enemy recalculated. The collapse did not sound like an explosion. It sounded like engines starting every morning, whether opposed or not.